During the final decades of the Warring States era, a young king named Yingzheng came to the throne of the western state of Qin. Working closely with his legalist advisors and military officials, King Ying was remarkably successful, so much so that desperate rulers of the rival warring states sent assassins to try and kill him. The most famous of these assassins was Jin Ke, a brilliant scholar and swordsman who allied himself with Crown Prince Dan of the state of Yan. Together with an assistant, Qin Wuyang, who had committed his first murder at the age of 13, the two plotted to murder the Qin king with a poisoned dagger wrapped in a map that they pretended to present to the king. The attempt failed at the last minute, the king survived, and both assassins were killed. This failed attempt has been the subject of some classic Chinese movies, including The Emperor and the Assassin and Hero. It is almost impossible to imagine how East Asian civilization might have unfolded had these assassins been successful, because after King Yingzheng conquered his rivals, he ended the Warring States era and unified much of China under the Qin dynasty with himself as absolute ruler. Although the Qin's reign was brief, only 15 years, their achievements made it possible for their successors, the Han, to establish a truly enormous Chinese empire that would last for 400 years, utterly transforming East Asian civilization. Such was the influence of the Qin that it is their dynastic name that has become the name for the modern country we call China today, and the Chinese call Zhongguo. This first imperial age of China was a period of tremendous innovation in several of the key themes in the big history of civilization, particularly in government, monumental building, society, and technology. In 221, the victorious Qin king proclaimed himself Shi Huangdi, a title he coined from the words Huang, which means august, and Di, which means Lord. This conjunction of august Lord now became the honorific for emperor, and the word Shi is the number one. So Shi Huangdi means first august Lord, or in reality, first emperor. Having created his own title, the first emperor in a reign of just 11 years undertook a stunning series of reforms that few rulers in history have matched in reigns 4 times as long. To unite the divided kingdoms and peoples of China, he needed to first weaken the power of the nobility, which he did by moving its leading members to the Qin capital and keeping them as virtual hostages. In place of Zhou dynasty feudalism, China was now divided into 36 provinces, each under the control of administrative bureaucracies rather than noble lords. To guard against future rebellions, the first emperor ordered the civilian population to surrender all the weapons they had amassed after centuries of warfare, and private possession of arms now joined the prohibited list in the new Qin law codes. This rigidly legalist code was promulgated throughout the empire, and it regulated all aspects of society. Lawbreakers were subject to harsh punishments, including hard labor, amputations, and death. What was not in keeping with the objective spirit of legalism, however, a system in which, in theory, no one is exempt from the law, whatever their status, was the fact that the emperor and his advisors would not tolerate criticism of the government. Realizing that scholars were using historical and philosophical texts to criticize government policies, the emperor passed a law banning dangerous books, accepting only treatises on divination, medicine, forestry, and farming. He ordered all banned books to be burnt, but kept a copy of each in his personal library, which ironically was burned to the ground by Han rebels in 206. Fortunately for us, private copies of these seminal texts of classical Chinese literature and philosophy survived. As an ultimate act to try and end dissension, the emperor is also reported to have had 460 Confucian scholars buried alive, although this has never been proven. The emperor next passed a series of linguistic and economic reforms aimed at further unifying the state. The writing system was reformed by the introduction of a new style called small seal script, which now was to be used throughout the Qin Empire and which persisted as the official script well into the Han dynasty. All weights, currency, and measurements were also standardized. Any attempt to maintain local measurement or writing systems was decreed to be an act of treason. The first emperor also introduced reforms that allowed for private ownership of land by the peasants, although frankly the lives of the peasants remained little better than those of serfs. Their lot was made worse by the massive building projects started by the first emperor, which required huge drafts of conscripted labor. The most impressive of these projects resulted in the construction of two of the great wonders of the world, the emperor's own tomb and the Great Wall of China. The structure that later became the Great Wall originated during the Warring States period, when several northern states had built their own walls for defense from nomadic tribes and from one another. The emperor ordered that these local walls should now be connected to form a single defensive system along the entire northern border, a massive undertaking that took 10 years to complete, using the labor of hundreds of thousands of conscripted workers. No historical records have survived to indicate the exact length or course of the Qin dynasty walls, but as the Silk Roads began to flourish during the subsequent Han dynasty, the wall was extended further to the west to protect the caravans as they crossed imperial territory, and later dynasties added further extensions. The present Great Wall, including those sections near Beijing that most visitors to China see today, was mostly constructed during the 15th and 16th centuries of the Common Era by the Ming dynasty, which used bricks and granite to build a truly formidable structure some 3,000 miles in length. Building the wall helped the Qin with defense, but it also symbolized the power of the first emperor, which may have been the real intention behind its construction, and indeed the construction of most monumental buildings during the era of agrarian civilizations. The second of Shi Huangdi's extraordinary building projects was his own tomb, a vast mausoleum near the modern city of Xi'an that is often referred to as the eighth wonder of the world. The tomb was lost to history for almost 2,000 years and was rediscovered by accident in 1974 by local farmers who were digging wells. Once Chinese archaeologists began to investigate, the vast underground mausoleum was revealed. When archaeologists started working in the East Vault, they discovered royal chariots with bronze horses and an awesome terracotta army of thousands of life-size soldiers created from a series of mix-and-match clay molds. Each terracotta soldier was then individualized by artists so that no two soldiers are identical. Each man was built with solid legs and a hollow torso, and each was sculpted wearing the uniform and carrying the weapons of their particular branch of the military: infantry, cavalry, charioteers with life-size chariots and clay horses, standing and kneeling archers, and officers occupying their own headquarters building. Finally, all the standing warriors were attached to clay plinths that rested on the tiled floor, which still resembles a modern parade ground today. Here, the massive army was lined up in perfect formation, ready to march out upon some otherworldly campaign. The purpose of the terracotta soldiers was to protect and fight for the emperor in the afterlife. The emperor had spent much of his life on the battlefield and had amassed untold numbers of revengeful enemies that were waiting for him on the other side. Sima Qian, the Han Dynasty historian who wrote a little over a century after the death of the first emperor, included a description of the tomb in his History of China, the Shizhi. He informs us that the tomb was under construction for 35 years, from 245 to 210, that is, from when the teenage Yingzheng became king of the Qin state right up until his death. Sima Qian noted that many thousands of laborers were conscripted to work on the mausoleum, most of whom were worked to death, and that all surviving laborers were killed and buried with the emperor to keep the tomb's location a secret. Chinese archaeologists have been meticulous in their work of excavating the site, and the central tomb containing the emperor himself has yet to be opened. But magnetic scans have revealed a large number of coins lying in the unopened tomb, so perhaps the royal treasury was also buried with the emperor. Sima Qian has a description of the emperor's personal tomb. A huge central chamber was topped by a ceiling studded with pearls and precious stones to represent the moon, sun, and stars. And exact representations of the Huanghe and Yangtze ran across the floor in rivers of mercury before flowing into a mercury ocean. Whale oil lamps, the longest burning substance known at the time, were used to light the scene, and the doors were sealed with molten copper. Finally, armed and primed crossbows were set up as booby traps for any who dared to enter the tomb of Qin Shi Huangdi. Such was the resting place of one of the most extraordinary rulers in world history, the sole surviving king of the brutal warring states period, the first emperor of East Asian civilization. As has often been the case throughout history, the charismatic first emperor was succeeded by a relatively inept son who could neither control the nobility nor feed the peasants. So rebel armies arose across China, leading quickly to the collapse of Qin authority. The most formidable of these rebel armies was led by a peasant named Liu Bang. By 206 BCE, Liu Bang had defeated his rivals and established the Han Dynasty, destined to rule China for more than 4 centuries between 206 BCE and 220 of the Common Era. These centuries were mostly characterized by strong central government, a well-organized bureaucracy, and extensive imperial expansion. Under the Han, China grew into a huge empire that stretched from Vietnam to Korea and from the China Sea deep into the heart of Central Asia. This dramatic expansion of Chinese civilization had world historical implications because it was under the Han that East Asia began to engage with the rest of Eurasia for the first time. Eventually, much of Afro-Eurasia was connected through a network of trade routes which facilitated extraordinary levels of material and cultural exchange. The Han era is divided into 2 periods, the early and late Han, separated by a period of non-Han rule under an emperor named Wang Mang. The early Han ruled from the city of Chang'an, modern Xi'an, the later Han from Luoyang. The early Han was the more successful of the two, reducing taxes on the peasants and enlisting the support of Confucian scholars to create a large bureaucracy staffed by skilled, salaried administrators to rule their empire. The country was divided into new administrative structures, 10 kingdoms and 83 commanderies. The commanderies were further divided into prefectures. We know there were 1,587 prefectures in the year 2 of the Common Era. The prefectures were divided into districts, and the districts into smaller units again, known as wards. This was the most complex and carefully organized imperial administrative structure of the ancient world. And it was only possible because of the quality of the bureaucracy. During the reign of Emperor Wu Di, the martial emperor, who ruled from 140 to 86 BCE, the Han government adopted Confucianism as the official philosophy of the state. This adoption is described by many historians as the triumph of Confucianism, and one of the reasons why Confucianism remained at the core of Chinese government for the next 2,000 years and is still employed to a degree by China's communist regime today. Wu Di established a state educational system based on knowledge of the Confucian classics, topped by an imperial Confucian academy to train future officials. He also strengthened the examination system by basing it squarely on the knowledge candidates possessed of the Confucian classics. This meant that candidates for a high office needed to have had considerable training as scholars before they could take up an administrative position, and these Confucian scholar bureaucrats now gained prominent status as the new elite. The Confucian scholars themselves also deserve credit for the triumph of Confucianism because they were able to adapt this flexible philosophy to the specific mood and need of the times without ever becoming yes men for the government. Nevertheless, Confucianism was a philosophy that insists on ethical behavior and loyalty to the state. The scholars remained committed to a type of principle loyalty, retaining a stance as critics of government policy if they believed it was warranted, and they were fierce watchdogs against unnecessary expenditure and imperial extravagance. But even with this so-called triumph of Confucianism, in the real world of politics, Emperor Wu Di, like his predecessors, still combined brutal legalist methods with these Confucian ideals. Recent discoveries by archaeologists of Han official documents have revealed that the Han had very harsh laws and punishments in place. And like the Qin, the Han government demanded conscripted labor service from its population. The duties of conscripted labor forces included lengthy military service, particularly after Wu Di instigated a period of aggressive imperial expansion late in the 2nd century BCE. Before long, Han armies were marching all over East and Central Asia, and under Wu Di, the Han Empire reached the heights of its power and size. Wu Di justified his expansionist policies in terms of self-defense against dangerous foes, a justification many empire builders, including Han contemporaries the Romans, have used throughout history. Once he had established military garrisons in far-flung regions of the empire, merchants and settlers were encouraged to move into these newly opened up regions, helping further expand the Chinese sphere of interest. To finance these military and colonization campaigns, Wu Di was forced to find new sources of revenue, including minting coins, monopolizing trade in lucrative goods, confiscating some land from the nobles, selling titles and high offices, and increasing taxes on business activity and on the peasants. Wu Di had the ability to deal with the potential fiscal crisis and peasant unrest that these policies generated, but the martial emperor was followed by a succession of weaker emperors, which hastened the demise of the early Han dynasty. In the year 8 CE, a well-meaning Confucian chief minister named Wang Mang overthrew the Han and enacted reforms to try and bring relief to the peasants, including the abolition of debt slavery and the introduction of a system to try and more equitably apportion land to peasant families. Wang Mang also tried to stabilize the prices of basic commodities by establishing government agencies to buy and stockpile surpluses when prices were low and sell them at a subsidized rate when scarcity forced prices to rise. Something similar to what reformist Roman politicians were trying at the opposite end of Eurasia. Ultimately, Wang Mang's attempts to radically redistribute wealth and taxes failed, and he was killed in battle in October of the year 23 CE. 2 years later, Liu Shu, a distant relative of the Liu family that had founded the Han dynasty, declared the start of the later Han dynasty, which went on to rule for almost another 2 centuries. The reigns of Liu Shu and his sons and grandsons were the high points of the later Han dynasty, but thereafter the dynasty suffered from corruption and political infighting amongst 3 powerful elite groups: the clans of the empresses, the Confucian bureaucrats, and the eunuchs. Eunuchs were men who, because they had been castrated at an early age, were increasingly trusted by emperors because they could never start a rival family. But none of these were able to improve the harsh lives of the peasants. In the year 153, China was beset with a series of natural calamities, including massive locust swarms and devastating floods along the Huanghe. These forced hundreds of thousands of people off the land and onto the roads in a desperate search for food. The government could do little to help, and Confucian scholars were so disgusted by the conniving and corruption in court that they organized mass protests against the eunuchs, who in turn orchestrated purges of Confucian officials who were exiled, jailed, or killed. Meanwhile, the reigning emperor Juan chose to ignore the growing economic and political storm and instead entertained thousands of concubines in his harem. By the late 2nd century, Taoist demands for equal land distribution had spread throughout the peasantry, and peasant insurgents of an uprising known as the Yellow Turban Rebellion swarmed across the North China Plain, destroying the principal agricultural sector of the country. Then, in 184, a massive rebellion led by radical Taoists, who were generally distrustful of government, resulted in widespread attacks on government officials all over the country. The result was that power once held by the Liu royalty now fell into the hands of regional warlords, such as Dongzhou, who attacked and burned the Han capital in 190 CE, and the brilliant but ruthless general Cao Cao, who, legend has it, possessed magical powers. The last figurehead Han Emperor Xian was allowed to continue his nominal reign until 220, when Cao Cao's son Cao Pi forced his abdication and brought to an end the Han Dynasty era of Chinese history. Such then is the extraordinary political and military story of the Han Dynasty, but it is perhaps even more memorable for its technological and cultural achievements. Let me begin to summarize the former with a list far from complete, The Han were responsible for the development of the world's first wheelbarrow to assist with farming and also with bureaucracy. I'll explain this in a moment. The first water mill to facilitate the pounding of grain by trip hammers and also to improve irrigation by attaching the mill to a chain pump. A type of seismometer to measure the strength of earthquakes. This was a domed bronze vessel containing an inverted pendulum that would swing if it detected an earthquake, dislodging a metal ball that would roll in the direction of the quake. Extraordinarily accurate astronomical observations, including the first precisely dated sunspot on May the 10th, 28 BCE, accurate records of the passage of comets, including one in 44 BCE that the Romans also noted around the time of the death of Julius Caesar, and Halley's Comet in 12 BCE, and also the first recorded observation of a supernova in 185 CE. The piston's bellows to assist in the manufacture of high-quality iron, and the invention of paper. Now that is quite a list, and too much to explore in detail in what remains of this lecture. So let me just focus on two of the most important of these innovations: the Han iron industry and the invention of paper. Iron making only arrived in China during the late Zhou dynasty, much later than in many other parts of Eurasia. Yet the Chinese advanced quickly from their first experiments with smelted iron to a position of undisputed Eurasian superiority. During the Warring States era, iron smelters in the kingdom of Wu developed a technique that would not be seen in Europe for another 500 years. Using sophisticated bellows, often powered by water wheels, and high-quality coal, the smelters of Wu were able to generate temperatures close to 1,130 degrees Celsius, as hot as a modern blast furnace today. By the first Silk Roads era, the Han had constructed 50 of these blast furnaces, and Chinese iron production was taking place on a scale that would not be seen in the West until the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century. By combining iron with a small amount of carbon at these temperatures, molten iron could be poured and cast into molds, a much more efficient technique than the individual forging of each piece of iron from a bloom, a porous mass of iron and slag. Yet forging remained the standard practice in the rest of Eurasia until well into medieval times. Han metallurgists also worked out that wrought iron and cast iron could be melted together to create an extraordinarily strong alloy of intermediate carbon content that we would call steel today. Perhaps the most remarkable Han invention of all was the first paper in world history, an invention that can be attributed to an otherwise obscure court eunuch of the later Han dynasty named Kai Lun, who presented this invention to the emperor in the year 105 CE. Kai Lun had worked out a process whereby the bark of mulberry trees, old linen materials, hemp, and even old fish nets were boiled together in a pot to produce a paste. The paste was then pounded, flushed in water, and dunked with a sieve containing a reed mat upon which the sheets of paper could be dried and bleached. The invention is a superb example of necessity driving innovation. As the bureaucracy reached the height of its size in the later Han, so the volume of official records that needed to be kept grew staggeringly large. Transporting even a small number of official documents transcribed on traditional bamboo strips required the use of a wheelbarrow. So the invention of paper must have come as a huge relief to the court and the bureaucrats. Kai Lun was rewarded by the emperor with a promotion and a noble title, but later he was caught up in a deadly palace power struggle and committed suicide by drinking poison while taking a bath. The oldest recorded evidence of the use of Kai Lun's invention, essentially the oldest piece of paper with writing on it that historians are aware of, was discovered in an excavation of a military watchtower in Inner Mongolia. The paper dates precisely to 110 CE, 5 years after Kai Lun had presented his invention to the emperor, when the Han military garrison stationed at the watchtower was forced to abandon its post because of an attack by militarized nomads. By the 3rd century, paper was in common use in China, and the invention had made its way into the Arab world by the 7th century. But it was not until the 12th century that paper making spread to Europe, making it possible for printers like Johannes Gutenberg to begin to mass produce printed books. The invention of paper allowed Chinese civilization to surge ahead of the West throughout the first millennium of the Common Era. Because knowledge was more rapidly disseminated, literacy became more widespread, and government bureaucracy was run much more efficiently because of the invention of paper. Only after the European Renaissance would the West begin to close the knowledge gap on the East. In the realm of social relations, the Han Dynasty is also noteworthy for its attitudes towards women and gender relations. During the later Han, new concepts emerged, that of the ideal woman, articulated in an essay titled Lessons for Women, written by the only woman ever appointed to the position of official court historian, Ban Zhao. Lessons for Women has been extraordinarily influential on East Asian civilization for almost 2,000 years. Although it appears to support patriarchy, it has been open to very different interpretations over the millennia and is still much discussed today. Ban Zhao suggests that women's subordination to men is part of the natural order of yin and yang, an ancient philosophy that divides the cosmos into two different but equally important forces. The way of husband and wife is intimately connected with yin and yang, she writes. Truly, it is the great principle of heaven and earth and the great basis of human relationships. In accordance with these principles, the ideal woman should have 4 qualifications: womanly virtue, womanly words, womanly bearing, and womanly work. Essentially, women should be chaste and modest, avoid vulgar language, keep themselves and their clothing clean, avoid gossip, prepare wine and food, and devote themselves to sewing and weaving. But Ban Zhao also makes an explicit demand for equal education for girls and boys, based on the argument that the only way women will learn to behave in the appropriate manner is through education. She wrote, "Yet only to teach men and not to teach women, is that not ignoring the essential relationship between them? It is the rule to begin to teach children to read at the age of 8 years, and by the age of 15 they ought then to be ready for cultural training. Only why should it not be that girls' education as well as boys be carried out according to this principle?" Her plea was heeded to a certain extent, opening up more opportunities for elite women to receive high levels of education in imperial China. The earliest Chinese dynasties of the Xia and Shang, which contributed much to the foundations of East Asian culture, were succeeded by the Zhou. Despite centuries of civil war, the Zhou went on to reinforce many of these foundational principles, and through the emergence of philosophies like Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism, helped create amongst the Chinese a self-perception of a unified people sharing a common destiny. But it was the Qin and Han dynasties that established a politically and culturally unified state, and then expanded this enormously until East Asia was brought into contact with the other civilizations of Afro-Eurasia for the first time, helping to create a single vast exchange network. These early developments, the emergence of writing, of dynastic rule, of great philosophies and ideals of governance, of an expansive worldview based on trade and exchange, and of quite stunning technological innovations, have essentially defined East Asian civilization ever since.